wanna know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
The general session will begin in 5 minutes. As a courtesy to the speakers and other audience members, please silence your mobile devices. We encourage you to keep your phones on and join the conversation on social media using hashtag NASEW19, hashtag SPICon, and hashtag ESICon. You can also find and connect with other attendees using the mobile app.
I could surely never know that
Ladies and gentlemen, the session is about to begin. Please take your seats. Let's take a moment to recognize our 2019 sponsors. Their support helps make the event a success and supports the missions of the Solar Energy Industries Association and the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Thank you to our Terawatt sponsors, CED Greentech, Longi, Panasonic, and Yingli. We also recognize our megawatt and kilowatt level sponsors. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Salt Lake City for North America Smart Energy Week, Solar Power International, and Energy Storage International.
Hello, I'm Governor Gary Herbert. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Utah to celebrate North America Clean and Smart Energy Week at Solar Power International. As one of the fastest growing and best places for business in the United States, energy plays a key role in Utah's successful economic formula. With rich and diverse natural resources, Utah is a national leader for smart energy solutions, delivering resilient, affordable, and clean energy outcomes for all. Over the past few years, we've continued to succeed in an ever-evolving energy landscape. Energy planning has allowed Utah's dynamic and diverse marketplace to thrive and define leadership on practical policy across our western states and the nation. For example, Utah will soon be the home to the largest renewable energy storage project in the world. The Utah Advanced Clean Energy Storage Project will develop 1,000 megawatts of 100% clean power and energy storage, deploying technologies and strategies that will eliminate emissions and enhance the power grid of the western United States. This project, strategically located in central west Utah, plans to deliver on 4 types of clean energy innovations, including compressed air energy storage, flow batteries, hydrogen, and fuel cells. It will produce enough power to meet the needs of 150,000 households in its first phase. So welcome to Utah. We hope you enjoy the events of this week.
Please welcome Solar Energy Industries Association President and Chief Executive Officer, Abby Hopper.
So good morning. Come on, we can do better than that. Good morning. You're the hearty that made it here at 8 o'clock. I'm impressed, friends. Good morning. I hope you all had a really fun night, a great opening night here in Salt Lake City, and that you're excited for the next couple of days. So who was here last night? Let me see your hand. I'm pretending like I can't actually see any of you because of the lights. Oh my gosh, you were here last night and you made it back this morning? Well done. So you know, last night we kicked off our first night of our show with a general session that focused on SEPA and SEIA's big picture visions for the energy industry and the role that Solar Plus plays in that future. So this conference, as you heard last night, it's gone from a gathering of super enthusiastic entrepreneurs charting a future for solar to being one of the largest shows in the nation for people talking about solar being the #1 source of new electricity generation over the next 11 years. That transformation is astounding. For those of you who came to the keynote panel last night, you know that I'm pretty fired up about this year's event, and I'm pretty fired up about our industry's capacity for growth. But also notable this year is the diversity of technologies represented here. Under SEPA's vision for a carbon-free energy system by 2050 and SEIA's Solar Plus Decade Plan, solar, wind, storage, electrification, infrastructure, and microgrids are all going to play in the new clean energy world that we're planning for. You don't hit our goal of 20% of electricity generation for solar if all of those other parts of the clean energy systems are not hitting on all cylinders. So the roadmap that we issued, how many people went home and read that roadmap last night? Show of hands? Oh my gosh, that's really sweet that some of you raised your hands. Thank you. So the roadmap, I don't believe you, but I like it. They all work for me, by the way, the ones that raised their hands. So the roadmap we issued yesterday speaks to that need for aggressive collaboration. And that really is the mission of Smart Energy Week, to bring together those companies that are making the move to clean energy and the people, all of you, who are driving that effort. So here you will see people from the wind industry, the onshore wind industry, the offshore wind industry, the distributed wind industry. You'll meet people who are making significant transportation infrastructure for electric vehicles. You'll meet the pioneers of America's burgeoning storage industry, which is critical to our industry's solar plus decade goals. And you'll learn new things from people developing promising energy innovations that may drive growth in the back half of the 2020s. And these are the faces of the solar plus decade. And increasingly and importantly, these faces will be more diverse, more accomplished, not that you're not accomplished, more accomplished, more brilliant, more visionary, and more visible to all of America as leaders of the impending clean energy revolution. So I urge each and every one of you to take advantage of these opportunities right in front of you and those that lie ahead, to meet your counterparts in other sectors of the clean energy industry, and think about how you can all work together and collaborate and make our vision a reality. And I promise you, I will stand right here, the center of this stage, and in Washington and in state capitals around the country, and fight for you and advocate for you as we try to make this vision a reality. So we're all familiar with innovations in technology as a key element in this clean energy transition. However, innovations in the regulatory environment are just as important. You heard that on my panel last night. In fact, those innovations are critical to accelerating scaled deployment of these new technologies. And that's why this morning, we've devoted this session to a deep dive on regulatory innovation. By the way, 8 a.m. regulatory innovation, I'm super impressed that you guys are all here. It's so critically important to our industry to make sure this happens. So if you were at the general session last night, you heard Julia Ham, the CEO of SEPA, talk about how this is one of SEPA's 4 pathways of focus. And so now I'd like to introduce SEPA's Janet Gale-Besser, who's going to lead a discussion with commissioners from across the country about the innovation currently happening in their states and the future of regulatory innovation. So enjoy this session that SEPA has put together, and I look forward to meeting all of you, literally all of you, this week as we figure out how to make this vision a reality. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage our moderator and 3 visionary regulatory commissioners, Janet Gale-Besser, Managing Director, Regulatory Innovation and Utility Business Models, Smart Electric Power Alliance; Jennifer Potter, Hawaii Public Utilities Commission; Brian Sheehan, Illinois Commerce Commission; Letha Tawney, Oregon Public Utility Commission.
Welcome to Innovation on the Regulatory Front. Before we begin, I want to talk a little mechanics. We're going to have opportunities for you to ask questions, and to do that, we want you to use the technology called Slido. You can submit your question and vote for the question you want to have answered by joining us at www.slido.com with the code that you see on the screen, #SPI2019. So we hope that you will be participating in this discussion, but we're going to lead off at this point. As we heard last night, and as Abby just mentioned, the pace of change in the electricity industry is accelerating, driven by new, emerging, and innovative technologies, many of which you can see on the showroom floor, changing economics, and increasing customer expectations. This accelerated pace of change poses challenges for regulation and market design. How to capture the benefits of innovation for all customers, as Paula pointed out last night. The implications for the system of increasing distributed energy resources, driven more and more by customer choices and declining costs than policy. And the implications of increasing commitments to a carbon-free energy future. During this general session, state regulatory commissioners will discuss ways they are evolving regulatory processes, practices, and structures to keep pace with the dynamic change in the energy industry, while maintaining safe, reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean electricity. We are fortunate to have with us 3 commissioners. First, Letha Tawney, Commissioner at the Oregon Public Utility Commission; Brian Sheehan, Commissioner and former Chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission; and Jenny Potter, from the commissioner at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. They'll each speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we will go into our questions. So Letha, why don't we start off with you?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me this morning. I would forgive the audience for thinking the session title is an oxymoron, and that this is roll their eyes at the idea of innovation in the regulatory space. But we know that we are crucial to an equitable, stable evolution of this sector that doesn't leave anybody behind. And that may not sound like innovation to a sort of Silicon Valley disruptor, but I think really stable and clear, transparent regulatory environment is crucial for innovation because it reduces risk for the innovators, for the investors, for the early adopters, and it helps to eliminate some of the information asymmetry that you get between incumbents and new entrants. And so the role we play, I think, is crucial, although I'm sure for everyone in the audience we don't move fast enough, no doubt. In Oregon, we have started down that journey. We did a report for the legislature last year about the future of the sector and what we think is coming. And in that, we really started to focus on how can we step back from individual technologies and having individual pricing for individual technical solutions and start thinking about responsive pricing around values. What are you bringing to the grid? What service? And how do we get consistency across all of those services and how we're pricing them? What's the price signal that's being sent out to the larger landscape? And I think that's important because we don't know which technology is going to be the winner. And if we can set up a landscape where the technologies can compete against each other, that'll be better for the end customer in the end. And we also don't know what customers are going to bring to the system. They are pursuing new opportunities, new choices, and sometimes those choices bring a lot of value to the system. Sometimes it's declining value. The next marginal customer choice brings less value. And if we're sending those signals out as best we can in our vertically integrated, no RTO, Northwest market, then I think we set up a landscape for innovation that's healthy. That's backed up by an investigation into capacity. When do we need to pay for capacity? What does that look like? What's the actual service we mean when we say capacity? People sort of throw the word around, but what you actually need on the grid is you need more specificity before you can pay for it. So we're pursuing that. But I'm really glad this session and the larger conference is thinking about equity. You know, in our sector, in the industry, energy industry, we point a lot to the communications revolution that happened with the iPhones and so on, and that was fantastic. I know I have 2 iPhones because I get to work for the state, so I must love them so much. But that revolution, it's added a whole new sector of jobs, right? Contract jobs for sometimes low-skilled participants in the economy. But you have to be able to pay the bill, and you have to be creditworthy enough that you can get the phone. And so in some ways, that revolution's left folks behind and raised barriers to economic participation. And we gloss over that a little bit. It's an afterthought on whether the technology is really meeting the needs of those communities. My kids go to a predominantly low-income school, and there's a fair number of families who are stuck with really crappy phones from the grocery store at really high prices. And they don't get to participate in those economic opportunities. And I think in the energy sector, you know, we've provided electricity across this very dispersed Western community through a social contract. And we need to be really thoughtful about what reinforces that social contract and what erodes it. And DERs can absolutely reinforce it. There's no question they have a role in that. But I worry a lot as a commissioner about, are we raising more barriers to participation in the economy, to communities thriving, or are we always reducing them? Because it's already difficult enough to dig out of poverty in the US. And I don't want this revolution to add to any of those barriers. And so when you have a commission that's asking hard questions, when you're coming to a commission and you're getting hard questions about the risk that's being put on customers or what's this going to do to bills, it's those folks that are front of mind for me. And I think this industry is well served when it can articulate what it brings to the system in terms of public benefits. Customer choice in and of itself is not automatically a customer benefit, but it could be. There can be ways to make that link. And I think also in our industry, we struggle with those folks just being flat out not in the room. And it's really hard to be sure we're meeting their needs when they're not at the table in the conversation. So I think we play a variety of important roles, and we're trying to tackle it really concretely in a variety of ways. But there are these long-term arcs that we also have to keep our eyes on. In particular, who are we inadvertently leaving behind?
Great. Thanks, Letha.
Thank you.
Brian, your thoughts?
Thank you, Janet. Let me just start by thanking you and Julia and SEPA for the invitation to be here. This is an exciting time to be in this industry, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness of getting the perspective of state regulators. Dialogues like this are really a valuable opportunity for us to listen and learn from people on the front line, and adds a lot of clarity and perspective to the decisions we make as regulators. As all of you know, the business of generating, distributing, and using electricity is really at a crossroads. The declining cost of wind, solar, battery storage, the digitalization of the grid, and electrification of transportation represent game-changing trends that policymakers, regulators, and the industry have to view holistically with an eye towards the public interest, consumer cost, and overall value. I'd like to help set the table a little bit for our discussion by providing some background on what we're doing in Illinois to promote innovation. Dating back to Samuel Insull's invention of the modern public utility in Chicago in the late 1800s, and his application of economies of scale to the generation and distribution of electricity, Illinois has been a leader in the provision of safe, reliable, affordable, and, as Janet pointed out, increasingly carbon-free electricity for more than 100 years. More recently, in the late 1990s, Illinois became one of the first states to deregulate our wholesale electricity markets and went from one of the highest cost states in the country to one of the lowest. In 2011, we passed the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act, which created a long-term $2.6 billion investment plan to upgrade and digitalize the existing grid. The law also included provisions for reliability, subjecting utilities to a recovery mechanism tied to outage duration and frequency. These investments have paid off with record reliability and resiliency. And by the end of this year, we'll have 100% statewide rollout of advanced metering infrastructure to almost 6 million customers. Recognizing the importance of zero carbon energy, in December of 2016, the state passed the Future Energy Jobs Act, which has been described as the most significant climate and clean energy law in our state's history. FEJA reaffirmed the state's goal of 25% renewables by 2025 and provides a budget of over $200 million annually to help get there. We expect the law to create about 3,000 megawatts of new solar and 1,400 megawatts of new wind, and also annual persistent reductions in total electricity used by 18% annually by the end of the 10-year duration. According to the Environmental Defense Fund, FEJA will result in an estimated $12 to $15 billion in new capital spending on energy efficiency and renewables through 2030. EDF estimates that the law will reduce harmful carbon dioxide emissions by more than 33 million metric tons annually, or the equivalent of more than 7 million cars. Combined with the ongoing impact of market and environmental changes, Illinois' closing 5 coal plants this year will likely reduce our carbon emissions from the power sector by more than 50% by 2030. Our new governor, J.B. Pritzker, supports an aggressive new goal of 100% carbon-free generation by 2050, so progress will likely accelerate. To experiment with the integration of renewables and to improve resiliency, we've authorized the development of 2 of the most advanced microgrids on the planet. Ameren's microgrid, adjacent to the campus at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, seamlessly integrates wind, solar, battery storage, and natural gas generation at utility-scale voltages on an active feeder. Commonwealth Edison's microgrid in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago will also integrate renewables, batteries, and electric car charging. And when paired with a microgrid on the campus of the Illinois Institute of Technology, it will become the first utility-scale microgrid cluster in North America. Clustering will assist our understanding and development of the grid of microgrids and will help open a door to the reliable integration of millions of smart, distributed resources in the future. As we know, to truly optimize the smart grid with renewable generation, batteries, and EVs, massive computing power and analytics will be necessary on a scale that's only economically feasible through cloud computing. Illinois is the first and only public utility commission currently pursuing a rulemaking allowing the capitalization of utility cloud computing expenditures, which will level the playing field between cloud and on-premise computing and eliminate the perverse financial incentive to invest in antiquated technology solutions. While we can't foresee all of the new technologies that are necessary for moving towards a lower carbon-intensive future, as regulators, we can provide leadership and frameworks that encourage innovation rather than stifle it. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you, Brian. Jenny?
Hi, yes. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, SEPA, for inviting me to participate. Thank you, Janet, and my fellow panel members. It's a pleasure to be here. I am from Hawaii, and Hawaii is very distinguished from the rest of the country in the way that its electrical infrastructure is structured. We have 6 distinct and isolated island grids. They're served by 4 utilities. One is a co-op, and the other 3 are integrated, vertically integrated IOUs, or investor-owned utilities. The utilities in Hawaii have experienced unprecedented adoption of photovoltaics and electric vehicles. We rank number 1 per capita in photovoltaic adoption for rooftops, and number 2 in the country for electric vehicles. What's remarkable about this, in Oahu, 1 out of 3 homes, single-family homes, has photovoltaics on it. And it's literally changed the way that we think about doing business with the electric industry and how we regulate as regulators. So we've introduced over the last decade several mechanisms that have attempted to address some of the challenges that have come up from the way that customers are making decisions on how to use energy and where they get their electricity from. So this includes things like energy efficiency, where we have very aggressive energy efficiency portfolio standards. We also we're the first state in the country to adopt a 100% renewable portfolio standard. And we also recently adopted a carbon neutrality standard. Because of this, and these ambitious state policies, as well as customer decisions about how to actually access their energy and electricity, the Commission has been tasked with thinking about how to continue the utilities' viability and structural integrity in the face of basically undermining financially how they achieve their revenues. And first, this began about a decade ago with what I will refer to as performance-based rate making. And there's a distinction that I'd like to draw and propose to all of you between performance-based rate making and performance-based regulation. To begin, I'd like to talk about performance-based rate making, and as much as that's what we started about 10 years ago, and we've built out and upon over the last 10 years, to where we are today with performance-based regulation, which was mandated by the state legislature in 2018. So in performance-based rate making, it really is the idea of how to assist the utility to make and be viable when consumers are making decisions about how to achieve and how to access their electricity and use electricity that differs from the conventional type of electricity delivery from a centralized resource. So the Commission instituted a docket called decoupling, and decoupling is breaking the link between utility revenues and the sale of KWH. So essentially, the utility no longer had to rely on a quantity of KWH being sold in order to recover an appropriate amount of revenues in order to remain viable. The next step in that process was to look at multi-year rate plans, and that meant that the utility would actually stay out from coming in for a rate case over a 3-year period. And this was really an idea to, one, to encourage administrative efficiency, but two, to also encourage the utility to look at ways to reduce cost internally so that they were competing in a way that was more consistent with a competitive business environment. So we evolved through a period of time. We introduced some revenue adjustment mechanisms and finally ended up in 2018 where we said, look, we've got independent power producers that are coming online with large-scale solar projects and batteries. We have wind turbines, and the utility is no longer making these large capital investments. And the mandate that was given by the state at that time was, okay, break the link between the capital investments from the utility and the revenues that they recover. And so that means that for every dollar that the utility spent on capital investments, they used to get an automatic or guaranteed rate of return of whatever was established within a rate case. And in our case, it's 10.5%. So the idea of breaking that link is obviously not very exciting to the utility. We need to think of ways that we could encourage them to come along for the ride in a way that they felt that their financial stability and security would remain intact. And so what we've done in the first phase of this proceeding, which began last year in July, the first phase lasted about a year. We encouraged participants from a number of parties. We had 10 different stakeholder groups with over 18 participants that came to the table and very actively participated in trying to help us develop what metrics, what kind of outcomes, what goals we needed to focus on in order to really change the fundamental way that we regulate the utility. Because if you're breaking the link between capital investments and revenues, you have to figure out a way to replace how those revenues are being accumulated by the utility, and do it in a way that isn't going to scare away the shareholders, because this is a much bigger scene than just the vertically integrated utility. And so through this process of the first phase, we came up with 3 goals which can apply to all utilities across the country. This is enhancing the customer experience, improving the utility performance, and then finally advancing the societal goals, which relates back to the public policy goals that are set by our legislatures and our governor. So in that, we came down from 29 different outcomes that were related to those goals down to about 12 outcomes. Those outcomes include things like DER asset effectiveness. And when I state what that is, that means utilizing all of those DERs that are scattered throughout our islands that customers have adopted and utilizing them in a way to support grid functions and to provide services to the grid, very similar to what was discussed earlier. And so also interconnection experience for providers and for customers. So penalties associated with not providing service for interconnection to the degree or a standard that's been established, and then incentives for the performance that exceeds that standard. There's a wide range of these which would fall under what's called a performance incentive mechanism, where they need to be real capital intensive mechanisms that would allow the utility to recover basis points, if you will, in order to remain viable. And we plan on including about 6 of those performance incentive mechanisms within this next phase, which will go on for about a year while we flesh out those details. The idea here is really that Hawaii is at the cusp of moving very quickly towards its 100% renewables. It has the very unique challenges because it's an isolated grid or multiple grids, and that we have a large population to serve that's already early adopters of different types of technologies, primarily because the cost of energy is so high. We have the highest prices in the country, sometimes by two times that of other utilities throughout the country. And really, we need to provide and enhance the customer experience where we have more equity and equality for those folks that can't afford photovoltaics and that are facing high energy burdens. And how is it that we address those? And we're more capable and able to do that through a performance-based regulatory framework than we are under the conventional regulatory compact that has existed for the last 100 years. So I'm happy to be here today and welcome your questions. Hopefully you'll have some for me, and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny and Brian and Letha. So just a reminder, if you have questions, please enter them in Slido, and I'm going to start with a few questions of my own, and then we would love to get to your questions. So Brian, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about how, ask you a little bit about how the changes that you're making are helping you to manage risk and uncertainty. The utilities perceive risk and uncertainty that they'll recover their costs if they invest in new technologies. And from talking with regulators, I understand regulators are concerned about the risk and uncertainty around the performance of these technologies and whether they really will benefit customers. And I know you've done some thinking on this issue.
Yeah, I think that, traditionally the way we think about it is a cost-benefit analysis. But when you're talking about innovation, it's almost by definition hard to assess the cost and benefit and the risk. And so my legal and policy advisor, Jimmy Zhang, and I wrote an article for Utility Dive a while back on applying the idea of sandbox to utility spending. And so, if you think about it, this was mentioned last night, I mentioned it this morning, the essential regulatory framework hasn't changed in more than 100 years. And the premise is to, in lieu of market forces, impose some discipline on a company to produce the most economically efficient result. And the problem is that it's all incentive-based. And so the utility is going to do what they get incentivized to do. They're not incentivized to innovate, which is really apparent when you look at their R&D spending. So probably for most companies in this room, high-tech companies spend about 25% of their revenue on R&D. Utilities spend less than 1%, and most spend far less than 1%. So we need to find a way to allow the utilities to take some risks and not be penalized. We don't have to get crazy with it. In Illinois, we have a very robust stakeholder process, and I think we can involve that process in determining good candidates for a sandbox experiment where on a very accelerated basis with a light regulatory touch, you let the utility experiment, and really without the fear of a penalty if they fail. And so that's something we have a stakeholder group working on now. It's something that I hope we'll see more of and could be a perfect tool for experimenting with a lot of the technologies I think that are represented at the conference and certainly represent the trend of where the industry is going.
Great, thank you. Jenny and Letha, your thoughts on managing risk and uncertainty?
Well, I think we've promised the legislature and are trying to figure out how to schedule in a very heavy set of dockets and other transformational things happening, how to take on performance-based. We probably start with rate making on a couple of narrow issues because the challenges in Oregon are a little different, but the underlying tension that both Brian and Jenny have described around the shareholders expect, ROE on capital, that's what brings them to the table, trying to pivot that gently. And I think cybersecurity is a really interesting, I personally am really interested in whether cybersecurity is a place where that performance-based rate making could apply, because cybersecurity is a space where you need the utility to be innovating. You need them to be not taking a compliance mindset, but really trying to reach out further. And you could think about PBR being applied in that context, a place where you really do want them to be trying to reach the edge rather than the more conservative approach.
Anything to add, Jenny?
Yeah, I think that one thing that we're very sensitive to the risk, and because we've heard it over and over from investors, we've heard it from the utilities, that if you do this too quickly, then you're going to undermine our business, and you're literally going to take us out in the stock market. And so we recognize the need to go slowly, but we also recognize that breaking the link, between capital investment and revenues isn't entirely possible at this juncture because we haven't done grid mod. And grid modernization is absolutely critical to where we're going down the road. So to say, okay, we're pulling the rug out from this completely and not allowing this anymore, we have to put in safeguards and mechanisms that will allow for the companies to make major project investments and still recover those costs within the rate base over time, and hopefully more quickly than, because I'd like to see AMI within the next year, but unfortunately we can't move that quickly. But the idea is to get this in the ground and to really continue down the road with some of these capital investments, allow them to get a return on investment, but slowly over time be phasing out how we're looking at doing this. Really what we're talking about is trading out inputs for outcomes. We want the utility to perform based on outcomes, no longer on inputs. Can you manage to performance rather than to cost recovery? And that's ultimately what this is about. And so that risk of making that shift does need to happen over time, and it needs to transition rather slowly, unfortunately. So in order to keep everybody comfortable that's sitting in the room. So
thank you. So speaking about everybody sitting in the room, you gave me a great line to connect these two thoughts. We heard last night from both Paula and Stephanie that you need to understand who the constituencies are. Who are you speaking to? Who is your audience? I know, Letha, in Oregon, you just completed last year a very extensive stakeholder process. And I want to ask all of you how you're engaging customers and stakeholders in processes to implement change. And so maybe, Letha, we can start with you, and Jenny, you mentioned stakeholder process as well.
Yeah, I think better, but still poorly. It's challenging. Our commissions are all set up with a history, and for very good reason, in an adversarial approach, right? Somebody brings a petition, then we go into a contested case proceeding, and you need to field a lawyer for 8 or 10 or 24 months to participate in that contested case. And that's important because it protects rights, it ensures transparency. There's a lot of historically good reasons why we have those proceedings, and I wouldn't throw them out wholesale. But I think we heard loud and clear in our stakeholder process where we really tried to step back from that for a moment, facilitate a different kind of conversation, bring different folks into the room who hadn't been there before. It's very common to sort of end up with the same sort of 4 or 5 constituencies in every case. And that, I think that was quite successful for opening our awareness that we need more collaborative processes. Contested cases are not great for coming up with creative collaborative solutions, because the idea is somebody, the first applicant, puts forward an idea, and everyone else spends all their time explaining why it's a really awful idea and it's going to collapse everything, and that's how the contested case proceeding goes forward, and then we're stuck with a record, because we have to make our decisions on the record, that has sort of this very odd, filled out sort of vision of what's possible. And then we have to make a decision and then justify it to the appellate court. And so that's not ideal for innovation. So we're trying to experiment with more workshops. You see that with commissioners attending workshops. That might sound not revolutionary, but it is. And that's taken some effort to get constituencies, not just the utilities, but also the IPPs and others, comfortable. So our chair, Chair Decker, successfully managed to organize 4 transmission workshops where we, as commissioners and our staff, could get smart on transmission in the West. which for anybody who works in the West, you understand with no RTO and so on and so forth, it's not particularly transparent or straightforward. All of the constituencies were nervous about stepping into that process. There were contested cases ongoing. They were concerned that their rights were going to be upended in some way by trying to do this education. And it really took a diverse steering committee to get everybody comfortable with the content that we were going to get to learn. And I think the lesson we took away from that is we really need the stakeholders to sometimes turn the temperature down a little bit and come to us early so that we can do the learning, so that we can hear there might be 6 different ideas, and then when we come to the contested case in the record, those can get hashed out in the appropriate way with the discovery and the testimony and so on. And so I think we're trying to find that line of what's the right balance between these different proceedings. When does each one suit its purpose? And it's not going to be fast. And it's just a fact of life.
Yeah. So let me just step in a minute and talk about stakeholders for this constituency. I think the usual players are the utilities, of course. Then there's usually a consumer advocate.
Yep.
And it may be the commission staff is involved.
Yes.
And there may be
An
the
industrial
industrial
advocate.
customer advocate. But some of the new stakeholders that you're really talking about bringing in are the low-income representatives, the community-based organizations, and the clean and distributed energy company voices, which haven't, they're in a business and they aren't really familiar necessarily with the arcane regulatory process and how you get things done.
And there's a real diversity among the clean energy voices, right? We have had, at different points in different dockets, relatively well-funded and industry associations for clean energy. But we get a real breadth, right? There's the local producers, there's the folks that are focused on DERs, there's the IPPs that want to do very large projects, and you really need a record that has that full breadth in order to get to a good decision. And I think if folks want different decisions out of commissions, unfortunately they need to invest in creating different records that give us that space and let us explore those issues within our jurisdiction.
Yeah. Jenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, I am in complete agreement. We were very lucky to have a constituency and stakeholders that participated in the performance-based regulation docket that included Tesla and representatives from AES and Sunrun and also from Blue Planet Foundation and different environmentalist groups and consumer advocacy groups. And so the way that we were structuring that, because we didn't want to just throw out sort of an idea and say, we're opening up this docket, give us the best and the brightest that you've got, which we have done with other dockets. But the staff actually proposed a scope and then sent it out to the parties, and the parties were able to respond to it. And then a second draft was developed that incorporated all of the feedback from the different stakeholders into it, including areas of disagreement, and then they responded upon that, and then we finally issued a final third report in which people were able to comment on. And then the commission took all of that feedback from the stakeholder, that was part of our record, and those 10 organizations that had spent so much time and energy focused on this proceeding. And that's one thing that I really just have to reiterate is we appreciate your time and the energy and the effort that goes into participating in these dockets. It is not an easy thing. We understand it's very labor intensive and writing and responding to that, but it's absolutely critical to building these records that help us make these decisions. And in our final phase 1 framework that we developed, it absolutely reflects the stakeholder input and their engagement in it. There's not an area that we just made it up. It literally has everything to do with how we developed this record over time. And so if you're going to do a stakeholder process, you absolutely have to incorporate that into the process and into your decision making. And so don't be afraid to get involved. I know the regulatory process seems pretty cumbersome, but your input actually counts, and it's really critical to helping us make good decisions.
Illinois is perhaps a good example of a state where these decisions have originated in the legislature as opposed to the commission. And Illinois has a very robust and constructive stakeholder group in this space that includes the renewable industry and consumer environmental advocates, the utilities, of course, but also importantly includes community-based organizations. And I think you see that manifest in the Future Energy Jobs Act, an important component of which is a program called Solar for All, which guarantees access to solar for low-income households, and also job training. And it's an important component because, when you look at diversity, and we heard Paula talk about it last night, when you go out and visit on these, site visits, you don't always see that diversity. But it's really essential, I think, in terms of, building the kind of coalitions and grassroots support for these programs that Stephanie talked about. And so I think Illinois is actually a really good example of, how these various stakeholder interests resulted in legislation that really, I think, is balanced. It achieves a lot of the goals. It achieves the utilities goals, the renewable communities goals, the consumer advocates goals, 18% persistent annual reductions in electricity use is significant, but also has these important components of diversity and equity. And so, as we think about where the industry is going, those are really important considerations and maybe a good model to look at.
Great, thank you. So I have one more question for the panelists, but I encourage all of you to be entering your questions in Slido because we'll get you in about 5 minutes. And I wanted to ask you, Jenny, to follow up a little bit in your discussion about making that transition from traditional, what we call cost of service-based or input-based regulation to a more outcomes or performance-based regulatory framework. And it's what do you see as the most important or the critical path change to make? You've talked about it's going to take a year or so, and understandable to change a system that's been in place for a long time. But what do you see as important maybe to make sure you stay on that track or accelerate it?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's not going to be possible to make a clean break from cost of service immediately, as much as we'd like to, because there's always this. One of the most important figures is expanding that multi-year rate plan. So right now we currently have a 3-year rate plan, and it's a stay-out period, and we're going to expand that to 5 years. And so that means that utilities cannot come back in for a rate increase for 5 years, which is essentially saying no cost of service in a way for 5 years. We're not going to be looking at it. But what happens at the end of that 5 years at this point is anybody's guess. We haven't stated specifically what's going to happen. And that's not just because none of us will be in term anymore, but it's because ultimately we want to see how the rest of these mechanisms actually play out. And there's always this sort of true up, if you will, to a revenue requirement that comes from. So we set a revenue requirement for the utility where they need to make earnings up to a certain point, and we use a revenue adjustment mechanism that attempts to true that up, and it's an adder onto a static rate charge. So this is all really exciting stuff. I'm sorry about that. So in doing so, that revenue adjustment mechanism can fluctuate over time, and as we introduce additional grid modernization projects into the process, or we have IPPs that come online and they displace current and conventional fossil fuel fire generation and they're cheaper, then that revenue adjustment mechanism would go down. And so we'll see that fluctuate over the next 5 years, and then we'll be able to determine what happens at that point. So there's mechanisms that we're going to have to institute and put in place that will still keep us fairly close to that cost of service, but it's going to be changing more due to the performance, one of the things that, that was mentioned earlier is we're instituting, and we have already instituted a performance incentive mechanism around adopting renewable energy projects. And so the utilities, for 10 years, we've had a competitive bidding framework that's been encouraging the utilities to go out to competitively bid for renewable energy. And not until last year did they actually do it. And the reason that they did it is we put money on it. We said, okay, we will pay you, utilities, X amount of dollars if you bring in a number of projects that are below cost, below your marginal cost, at a specific, and by this specific deadline. And guess what? They did it. And they brought us 8 projects, and they all, 8 PPAs, and 7 of them were approved by the commission within 3 months. And so we expedited that whole process. The reason they didn't do that earlier is they did not have an incentive to do so. So the Slido question that I'm looking at right now is, in a regulated market, how is it, what's my perspective on what's the most beneficial in supporting renewables? If you have the ability to offer performance incentive mechanisms to the utilities to do what it is that is best for society, that is going to help meet societal goals, that is going to help get you to your renewable energy goals, and that is going to bring cleaner, more carbon neutral resources online, then performance incentive mechanisms are a darn good way to do it. But you do need to be in a market that's regulated, because we have the ability to say, here's the price tag associated with you doing this or not doing it, and here's the incentive that we're willing to pay you in order to bring these things online quicker and faster.
Yeah.
So,
Brian, what's your perspective from a restructured market or a deregulated market in terms of its ability to be supporting renewable development?
Well, I think I would throw in all zero carbon.
Yeah.
So Illinois obviously is a big nuclear state. We have the largest nuclear fleet in the country, but in this case, nuclear and renewables are in the same camp, really, when it comes to pricing at the RTO level. And the challenge is that we have state-mandated goals for. We have an RPS, of course. We have, as a result of FEJA, we have a ZEC that maintains the economics of our nuclear power plants. But there is a really strong effort on PJM's part to actually mitigate the value of those subsidies. And so it remains to be seen how this is going to turn out. I've been fairly outspoken and critical of the way that PJM has handled the situation and predicted some time ago that it would result in the collapse of their capacity markets, and I think that is still true. If you look at the political reality of and the strength of support in and interest in renewables, and in states like Illinois in zero carbon electricity generated by nuclear, they're not going to, cede that to a bureaucracy 1,000 miles away. It's just not going to happen. And so I think Illinois eventually and other states in a similar position are going to pull out of those capacity markets, and they're not going to look like they look today. So I think that's there's just this tension that's unresolved.
Yeah. So it sounds like renewables are supported in different ways in both regulated and restructured markets. You made a comment, Letha, when you were speaking about DERs can be either raising or removing barriers. And I guess the question I want to ask you is, how can you make sure that they're actually removing barriers and that they're actually bringing greater value to all customers on the system?
Well, I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right?
Well,
I mean, it's just sort of that's the existential question in some respects that I think we're seeing play out in Hawaii, but in other places as well. This is where we're investing a huge amount in trying to get to that consistent price signal around what is what's the service as opposed to the technology, I think everyone is going to feel at the end of those dockets that we're undervaluing whatever it is they're bringing to the system. They just are going to. It's because what they're bringing to the system is their baby, and it's their business model, and I get that. Hopefully through a transparent process, it'll be clear why we've balanced all the interests and landed where we have, and there's a lot of data input underneath it. But, you know, electricity is a tricky thing where even where there's a deregulated market on some level, price formation is still very, very heavily shaped by the regulator, either by the legislature putting in a subsidy or by the regulator trying to actually just do price formation in PURPA, just set the price, here's what it's going to be. Hopefully it's data driven on some level. Or, you know, in Oregon, we've invested a huge amount in trying to make our procurements by our utilities competitive and transparent from that perspective to try to drive that price formation. But I think all those, you know, tools, however clumsy they are, it's a natural monopoly on some level. There are these economies of scale that make incumbents, and so we're going to have to keep trying these different tools for price formation in order to get the best deal for the public interest. And I think the role of the commissioner is to keep that in mind. It's the best outcome for the larger community, the public interest, and that's not always easy to explain to folks who are pretty sure you've undervalued them.
Janet, can I jump in real quick on this point, and kind of a related point that Brian Davis from Shell made yesterday. He talked about the risk of aging infrastructure, and talked about the role of distribution utilities in orchestrating deployment of DERs. I think one of the real barriers to greater deployment is going to be the condition of basic infrastructure, right? And the context is a little different, but I think, you know, we saw some of that in the Camp Fire situation in California, right, where you've got a 100-year-old power line, 100-year-old transmission line fail. And so, you know, you can put a lot of fancy things out there, but if your basic infrastructure isn't intact, and I won't just pick on California, we had a situation in Chicago some years ago where the feeder that served the downtown business district failed. And it was a decades-old, paper-insulated, oil-cooled feeder. And for many, many years, ComEd had not had a constructive regulatory environment. I mean, let's just be honest. And we have formula rates in Illinois because they went to the legislature and said, look, we can't get a fair shake. And so they took away a lot of the commission's regulatory powers in terms of assigning ROE and the economics around investments away from the commission. So having a constructive regulatory environment is important. We have a statutory mandate that we've taken seriously at least the last 5 years to balance interests. We're not, you know, the consumer's advocate, we're not the utility's advocate, we're not solar's advocate. Our responsibility is to the public interest, broadly speaking. And so part of the challenge, I think, going forward is going to be managing the costs of these enormous investments required to have a system that can accept the levels of penetration of DERs that we expect.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think I want to turn to a question we've gotten from the audience here that's really very much in line with the theme of Smart Energy Week, which is this opportunity to create new partnerships between all the players here, between solar, wind, and other new technologies, but also between the competitive vendors and the utilities. And so I think one of the question we've gotten is, can you think of good models that you've seen where the utility has worked with third-party vendors to make investments? And following up on your comments, Brian, I think there's also sometimes the opportunity to use what I call other people's money if in fact there's a partnership between a competitive provider and the utility. It's maybe not all customer or ratepayer money. So any examples of good partnerships?
Yeah, I think that the first one that comes to mind, and probably the only one that comes to mind, is electric vehicle charging. The utilities can do all the make-ready, but they're not in the business of building chargers, and they can set rates and help, for the electric vehicle chargers themselves that may be operated and maintained by the third party. And these obviously are helping consumers with range anxiety, with ability to charge at work. So this would be an excellent example of where utilities would come together with a third party to help facilitate consumer choice and adoption of more DERs.
Good.
I would flip that around a little bit in our case. We have restructured wholesale markets, and as a result, we have a lot of retail competition. We have almost 100 competitive retail suppliers. And unfortunately, their customers pay about $100 million more every year than they would if they got just the default service from the incumbent utility.
Wow.
And if you're a customer who wants to and is willing to spend a little more to support renewables, and there are many out there, and it's good that they have that choice, that's fine. But they employ, I shouldn't say all, some employ very aggressive marketing practices that verge on fraud. And it really detracts from the industry. Stephanie talked about grassroots, in terms of kind of building momentum. This is an example where grassroots, in a negative way, maybe is detracting from momentum.
There's always the bad apple that can color the entire.
Well, and I think it's sort of horror stories like that. Oregon has chosen a very, the legislature tends to choose to designate a player and invest them with the responsibility. So in Oregon, there is a fee on everyone's bill to go, that's the public purpose charge, that then is set aside, and we act as the accountability agency for the Energy Trust of Oregon. And they are charged with going out and getting from consumers of the IOUs all the cost-effective energy efficiency. And they've done an amazing job. I mean, I'm biased. I'm really impressed with what they've done. They go and they get that energy efficiency for such a low dollar, LCOE for the customer overall. It's fantastic.
LCOE is low cost.
Life
cost of entry.
Yes. And
what it costs to do it at the beginning.
Yes, and they, that partnership with the utilities, I think there was a distrust that the legislature and stakeholders at the legislature said, is this really, they don't have the right incentives, are private parties going to go out and do it effectively? We're going to invest this important task in this nonprofit that has all this accountability around it. And it's in Oregon, it's worked well. There's probably other approaches that could also work, but that tends to be culturally where we go, partly because we're trying to grapple in our imperfect way with these kinds of challenges.
Okay. So we have only a few minutes left, and I wanted to give each of you a chance to maybe make some last comments.
Well, I think I would echo what Jenny's comment about your voices in the process are really important. It can be arcane, it can be frustrating, it can feel, I'm certain, like the utilities can out-lawyer everybody. We recognize that asymmetry. And we are working hard to try to balance all of that. And I think don't underestimate the importance of really developing that different record, educating our staff, particularly early in a process. And that gives us room to get to a different decision, much like I think Hawaii's a long way down this path, but we're all in different places on that same path trying to get to grips with many of the same issues.
Great,
and make your arguments in the public interest.
Yeah, I think I would just underscore that as well. It's important to remember that commissions are quasi-judicial, and it's really our job to be judges and not advocates. And our responsibility is in the public interest. It's not in a particular business or a business model. But I think there were some important points made last night that, I'd like to reiterate, and I really agree with strongly. Diversity in this space is going to only increase in importance. And so it's important to recognize that. We've recognized it in Illinois. Our utilities support about $2 billion a year in diverse supply spending. And so from the utility standpoint, that's a really important consideration for them. Aging infrastructure is a real issue. Yeah. And utility regulators, I think, they think about the rate impact every day. That's really front and center for us. And I think most regulators have sort of a budget in mind, if you want to think about it that way. And the budget for new things on the grid, whether it's solar or batteries or EV charging stations, comes after kind of just keeping the lights on, literally. And so it's important, I think, just to keep in mind that, at the end of the day, none of us want to get a call from the governor saying, why do you have a blackout? Why do you have a brownout, right? I mean, that's like our worst nightmare. So utility regulators and our staffs and utilities are extraordinarily conservative. And so it's important just to understand that and understand that change comes slowly for the most part. But there are good examples out there. I would hold Illinois out as a good example, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you about how we've managed this change and how we see the future developing.
Yeah. So, Jenny?
Last thoughts?
Last thoughts?
Excellent. Sure.
And leave me a few seconds, please.
Absolutely. I actually think that Hawaii's on an accelerated, we're on a fast track, and this commission in particular wants to see change as quickly as possible. And for one reason is our fleet of fossil fuel generation and coal plants are the dirtiest in the country. We use bunker fuel in order to produce electricity. It's the dirtiest that you can possibly get. We use more oil than any other state in the country in order to produce electricity. We have to import all of it because, as you know, we're out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that makes us highly vulnerable to economic forces. And so the idea of taking our time and moving slowly to this transition to renewable energy isn't something that we can necessarily afford, not for our customers and the cost of electricity, but because of ultimately the environmental impacts and the economic instability that we're facing as a state.
Great, thank you. Well, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. I hear them all inviting everyone to participate. They want your voices to be heard. And next up, we have Julia Ham, the President and CEO of SEPA.
That was a fantastic panel. Really important topic. Obviously, as you've heard multiple times now, we at SEPA think it's so important that in the 4 focus areas for our organization, regulatory innovation is one of those. I don't think Janet mentioned it, but within the regulatory innovation pathway of work, we have a whole initiative that's called Renovate, that's specifically focused on bringing together stakeholders across the country, commissioners, consumer advocates, utility executives, tech company executives, state legislators, to work together to identify some of the solutions to the common challenges that this industry faces with state regulatory processes, practices, and structures. So if you're interested in those topics, please connect with us. We will make sure you get plugged in and have the information and resources that are coming through that initiative available to you. So in addition to state policy and regulation, which is critically important to our industry, there's also the federal government, which is equally as important to us. So I'm very pleased this morning to have with us Daniel Simmons, who's the Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. 2 years ago, Daniel announced that the solar industry had achieved the 2020 Sunshot solar cost goal of 6 cents per kilowatt hour 3 years early. When the Sunshot Initiative was launched in 2011, it set out to make solar electricity market competitive with other forms of energy without subsidies by 2020. At the time, that seemed extremely ambitious. But not only did the industry achieve it, but we achieved it early. Daniel also announced a new focus for EERE: grid reliability, resilience, and affordability. This is becoming even more critical as more solar and other resources are being added to the grid. Many of the technologies and innovations highlighted here at Smart Energy Week are at the core of EERE's focus at DOE. I'd like to highlight one of these efforts. With DOE's support, SEPA has been working on an important project with the National Labs PNNL and LBNL to facilitate plug-and-play DER. Increasingly, DERs are being added to the grid, and their integration can be a challenge. One solution is to imagine an electric power system with an interface designed to simply plug in multiple types of DER and have them easily connect and interact with the electric grid. Thank you to DOE and EER specifically for their support of the plug-and-play DER challenge, and we'll be having its big unveiling here tomorrow. Today, Daniel is here to talk about another important priority: U.S. solar manufacturing and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs that want to bring new solar product to the market in the U.S. face daunting challenges. The U.S. Department of Energy's American-Made Solar Prize is designed to eliminate the barriers facing the nation's innovators and create opportunities to make solar products here in America. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Simmons, Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julia. It is great to be here today. It's great to be here in Utah. Utah is my home state. So when I found out, when they told me that SPI was going to be in Utah this year, I obviously said yes. I mean, I would have said yes if it was somewhere where I didn't like so much, like Tampa, but at least during the summer. But it is great to be here in my home. So, and also, I really like that introduction because it talked about some of the things that we were thinking about 2 years ago when it comes to solar energy, as in the costs have fallen faster than we had anticipated, and we really need to think about what are the most important areas of research today. So it is great to be here representing the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at SPI. And it is rare to have the opportunity to talk to an audience that is as informed as all of you are in solar energy. Today, I have the opportunity to talk about solar prizes and what we are doing to advance solar prizes. But it is great again that we have people that are as knowledgeable as you are. The Department of Energy's American-Made Solar Prize, for those who don't know, was launched in January 2018. It is to spur innovation in solar manufacturing in the United States. Now, obviously, we do a good job in solar manufacturing in certain areas of the supply chain, but we could do more across the entire supply chain. And that is really what we're trying to incentivize. That is what we're trying to do. So to give you more background on this prize, we have a video for you today. So please press play.
The $16 billion solar industry has created hundreds of thousands of jobs, but things are just getting started. To support a new generation of American solar innovators and entrepreneurs, the Department of Energy created a $3 million prize competition. The American-Made Solar Prize is helping transform great ideas into technology solutions that are ready for market.
The Solar Prize is wide open as far as opportunity to propose your best and brightest idea.
It's ideal for an innovator who wants to have the runway, the financial runway to develop the technology and actually get over that valley of death of actually having a producible product.
Through a series of contests, competitors win progressively larger and larger cash prizes to advance their ideas.
One of the really fantastic parts about the Solar Prize competition is it's a prize, and the ability to get the money without all the complicated overhead and administration means that we were able to put it to use immediately.
Each step of the way, competitors will also receive expertise, technical support, and guidance from national laboratories, energy incubators, and industry partners.
The network is there to help teams fill in gaps. So if a team doesn't necessarily have access to a prototyping facility, we are there for them. And if they don't have access to maybe find the right connections that they need for testing or business plan development, we have people that will help them with that as well.
The partnerships we've developed as a result of the American-made Solar Challenge have been tremendous. They have helped us write and rewrite our business plan, our patents filings, our CAD specifications. The partnership in this community has really been tremendous, and our partners have dramatically accelerated and de-risked our business plan.
By supporting these entrepreneurs, the American-made Solar Prize advances solar innovation and empowers the leaders shaping our energy future.
Yeah, we're all trying to work for the same future, right?
We are, and it's inspiring to be around like a lot of different, completely different areas with all the unifying aspect of clean energy, renewable energy, but completely different approaches at different aspects of the problem, and that gives us energy.
Visit AmericanMadeChallenges.org to learn more.
All right, I have nothing left to say. That is a very good job, a very good overview. From the administration's perspective, improving domestic manufacturing is a priority for the administration, and we believe that this prize competition, the 3 rounds of this prize competition, is one way to help accomplish that. Today, I'll have the honor of announcing the selection of the 2 final winners from the first round of the competition, and they will split a $1 million prize pool. Over the past year, 20 teams have been competing to design an innovative technology prototype, forge partnerships, and bring their product to the manufacturing floor. Today, a panel of expert judges will decide which 2 groups will take home $50,000 each. So please join us downstairs. In fact, apparently it is directly downstairs in room 255E at 9:30, immediately following the end of this session, to experience our demo day. And at 5 p.m. this evening, we will be announcing the winners who will collect their hard-earned prize. I am excited about the benefits of DOE-sponsored prizes like this to our energy economy. We need innovation. We need to continue to accelerate industrial progress, identify opportunities, and drive down manufacturing costs for a domestic energy that keeps the U.S. on the very edge of the solar industry globally. The American-made Solar Prize is a fine example of economic problem-solving through public-private partnership and collaboration. One of the most important things about this prize is we wanted to make sure that people had access to the incredible resources that are 17 national laboratories, including the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, over which my office is the steward. Our national labs are a great public-private partnership, and we really hope to accelerate their research in the future. Allowing proven innovators to access to this unrivaled resource will rebound benefits both to the government, but also, hopefully and most importantly, to the people themselves. And at the Department of Energy, we fully embrace the prize model. We have not just launched the American-made Solar Prize, but many other prizes as well, including prizes in terms of battery recycling and a solar desalination prize that I had the opportunity to announce yesterday at WEFTEC, which is the largest conference in terms of water quality using solar energy to power desalination technologies. At each stage of these prize competitions, contestants have access to a network of experts, facilities, partners, and potential funding sources to sustain financing and enhance development of their innovations. This comprehensive approach provides entrepreneurs with the connections they need to succeed, as well as the ability to move their concert forward after the end of the competition itself. In addition to lucrative prizes, the American-made Solar Prize contestants also, the prize model offers contestants access to the American-made network, which was designed to strengthen the cross-sector connections that will help accelerate and sustain American innovation. This network is comprised of the Department of Energy's national labs, incubators, investors, and seasoned industry mentors, all of whom provide technical insight, provide validation, and strategic support throughout the entire competition. Members of the American-made Solar Network can win performance payments through recruiting, mentoring, and advancing the Solar Prize competitors. This program creates a foundation and a reinforcing network that encourages rapid manufacturing and future, and most important of all, future business growth. This will simultaneously enable the rapid development of technology and strengthen the critical connections needed for product commercialization. And this prize competition will have 3 rounds, and each round can run concurrently. For example, if people missed the first round, they could definitely enter the 3rd round. More than 100 teams have submitted proposals to the 2nd round of the Solar Prize, 20 of which were selected to advance to the next contest. So there are multiple contests within each round. So of these 20 competitors, some of whom are in attendance today, this is for the 2nd round. They will take home part of a $500,000 cash prize, and we can't wait to see what the 2nd round competitors accomplish. The 3rd and final announcement for today is that round 3 of the American Solar Prize starts now. So if you know of people that had missed the 1st round or had missed the 2nd round, they can participate in the 3rd round. These 3 rounds of prizes will help accelerate solar manufacturing in ways that traditional funding mechanisms have not, preparing an industry for a continuous wave of American leadership in the $150 billion solar industry. Needless to say, we have a wealth of opportunities over the next 2 days to learn about cutting technologies in this field. And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention the Plug and Play DER Challenge, as Julia mentioned just before me, which will take place at 10:30 tomorrow morning at the Smart Energy and Microgrid Theater. This presentation will involve a live demonstration of the hardware and software interfaces for integrating distributed energy resources into a utility grid. Energy integration is one of my core priorities at the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and I'm eager to learn more about some of the concepts that will be on display tomorrow. I'd like to thank everyone in this room for playing a part in the evolution, the expansion, and the advancement of solar energy in the United States. Through the American-made Solar Prize, we hope to spur the next wave of solar manufacturing technology innovations by tapping into the nation's competitive spirit and an unrivaled innovation ecosystem. This program will hopefully, our goal is to help re-energize this vital American industry and support growth in the manufacturing sector. I hope you're as excited as I am to learn more about the competitors at our demo day, which again will be held in room 255 directly following this meeting. And I'm extremely impressed with the competitors' achievements and also grateful for the work of our Solar Energy Technology Office and also the National Renewable Energy Office, Energy Laboratory, for the work that they have done to make this prize a reality. Thank you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for attending the general session. Today's education sessions start at 9:30 a.m. on the 2nd floor of the Salt Palace Convention Center, and the exhibit hall opens at 10 a.m. on the 1st level of the Convention Center. We look forward to seeing you tonight for the annual block party at Gallivan Center.